JMRL's name working group, and I'm going to give a brief introduction and catch everybody up on what is happening. In April of this year, a group of descendants of enslaved laborers from Monticello requested that the library board change the name of the regional library system. The board discovered in the months to come that this is not a JMRL decision, and any name change would need to be codified in the regional agreement between Charlottesville, Albemarle, Greene, Louisa, and Nelson. At that point, the library board appointed a working group of staff and trustees tasked with synthesizing public input on the name of JMRL and making a recommendation to the full board on any particular action that JMRL should take. Any solicitation of expertise or input, such as tonight's meeting, needed to come with an upfront understanding that the authority to change the name of JMRL lies with Charlottesville, Albemarle, Greene, Louisa, and Nelson. So from the library side, this working group is made up of myself. I'm David Plunkett, the director of the library system. AJ Mosley, JMRL's business manager. One of JMRL's Albemarle appointed trustees, Michael Powers. And one of JMRL's Charlottesville appointed trustees, Lisa Woolfolk. So this working group has called this meeting with local experts in order to ask a series of questions designed to understand the process that the three organizations, you all, these experts represented, used for self-reflection. So would you all mind briefly introducing yourselves? Esteemed guests.
I think Karen has her hand up, so.
Karen, go ahead.
Good evening. I'm Karen Waters. I am the Director of Community Education for Albemarle County Public Schools, where I serve as the project manager for our school name review. I have a master's in teaching and a bachelor's in history from the University of Virginia, where I was honored to study under Phyllis Leffler and to collaborate with her and Frank Dukes on some projects. And I am delighted to be here. I'm a great fan of our local library, so I'm honored to help out in this capacity.
Go ahead, Phyllis.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'm Phyllis Leffler, and I'm really honored to be here this evening. Give me 1 minute to just say how excited I am that Karen is on this call, because I often don't see Karen, and it's lovely to see you in your little box, if not in person. Karen, Frank, and I all co-taught a class together outside of the subject of what we're talking about tonight. So it's a little bit of a homecoming, I guess. Anyway, I am a retired historian from the University of Virginia, and I was asked to serve at the University of Virginia on a committee that was put together to consider a process for the renaming of buildings, monuments, or landscape spaces at the university. That we can talk about this later. That committee has now been disbanded, but we did focus a lot of attention on what principles we might apply for considering any kind of name changes.
Frank?
Greetings, everybody, and really glad to see everybody here too. And I'm Frank Dukes. I'm with the University of Virginia's Institute for Engagement and Negotiation. And I've had the privilege and responsibility of actually serving as a community member on the Blue Ribbon Commission on Race, Memorials, and Public Spaces that was charged with looking at not only the monuments and memorials, the Confederate monuments and memorials that we have downtown, but also other racialized spaces in Charlottesville and what we should be doing with those. And then I've also been a facilitator for communities that are dealing with problematic spaces, building names, including the, but also more positively, the memorial to enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia.
Well, thank you all so much. So we do have a series of questions that the working group is interested tonight in teasing out what kind of process you all went through. And hopefully we can toss these out and you all can answer, and maybe if there are follow-up questions from the working group, we'll get into it, or if there's follow-up from other members of the panel as well. So the first one was if you would each briefly describe the experience you've had with organizational namespaces or memorials, and with what organization. So you touched on that a little bit, but maybe a little bit more in depth. And maybe we'll go quickly round robin in that same order. So Karen, you're on the spot.
Sure. I served on the name review, the committee for Broadus-Wood Elementary School in Albemarle County. And prior to becoming the project manager for the school name review, I was a committee member. And then later I was the project manager, moved on to Harvard. And so I stepped into that space. And I have since coordinated, I would say, the name review process for Mary Carr Greer Elementary School. And we are presently in the process of reviewing the name of Meriwether Lewis Elementary School. Additionally, I served on a committee that looked at a name for a field at Burley Elementary School, and that project is still in the process. And previous to that, I have not done any actual naming, other than to sort of be aware of some of the names that we had at the university previous to their certain spaces being renamed, such as Jordan Hall, and understanding that we have so many buildings that are named for folks that aren't necessarily reflective of the values of the institutions. Sometimes we know that names happen primarily from donations and for other reasons. And sometimes names happen in one historical context and times change. So, but those are my actual concrete experiences with naming.
Thank you, Karen. Phyllis, do you want to add anything about the experience that you've had?
Well, just, I guess, to give a little bit more background about, I mean, anyone who knows anything about the University of Virginia knows that there are many tentacles out in many different directions, and things evolve from one thing to another without any clear reason necessarily as to why they're evolving the way they are. So to my understanding, there was a small committee that got established at the University of Virginia in the aftermath of the Unite the Right rally. And that committee was put together through the University of Virginia's architect's office in order to begin to think about how to recontextualize or explain the landscape of the university, sort of buildings, monuments, etc. So then there was a small dean's working group that came out of that. And then that grew, and I believe that grew, I don't know for sure, to a different group, because the university had this President's Commission on the University in the Age of Slavery. It then became the next stage after 7 years was the President's Commission on the University in the Age of Segregation, thinking about the history of the university between 1865 and 1965. And I was asked to serve on that commission, the University in the Age of Segregation. And we quickly realized as a committee that this issue of names and names on buildings could be problematic. And so from that commission evolved this other committee on naming. And as I said earlier, our role, as we saw it, was to come up with a set of principles, not to determine what buildings should have their names changed, but a set of principles that then could be applied by what was called the Committee on Names at the university, which we recommended would be reconstituted as a different group. So again, layers on layers was part of that process.
Thanks, Phyllis and Karen. So I'm going to stick with the Blue Ribbon Commission on Race, Memorials, and Public Spaces, since that was the most prominent. And again, I also do have experience facilitating many conversations about different sites as well. But that one took place in 2016 and was 9 members appointed by the City Council. 3 of them actually represented existing organizations. And we met over a period of 6 months and had something like 17 meetings, 3 of them public meetings. And I know you've got some follow-up questions we can get more into with that. So I'll just leave it at that.
That the library board received in May, and I'm wondering, the working group is wondering what the impetus was for each of your organizations. Was there a specific spark that led to the creations of the group that you all were working with? Was there a directive that came down from administration or management, or what was the general reason that the work began?
Well, I can speak for Albemarle County Public Schools. We have had a naming policy in effect since 1993. But in 2018, again, in the wake of the Unite the Right rally, the school board decided to add the concept of compliance with our values as a criteria for determining which names are appropriate. Presently, our policy addresses names for new facilities, as well as reviewing names of any facility. And, as a school system, I don't think folks really recognize, we have fields, we have, any number of facilities besides just the schools themselves that have names. And the policy encompasses more than just looking at whether a name might be of someone who is of scurrilous character. It also evaluates whether or not donations warrant naming privileges and things of that nature. But in 2018, the school board said, we need to have a look at the names specifically of our schools, and to make sure that the individuals for whom they are named align with our values. And that was the impetus for really having a look at whether or not each individual fits the criteria that current community members feel warrants a building being named for them.
Okay, I'll pick up on that. And again, I think I've already talked about this a little bit, but the President's Commission on the University in the Age of Segregation had a very open-ended charge. And as we started to explore what we thought would be appropriate to do in looking at the university in that time and thinking about, what do we want to say? What do we want to do? What do we want to remember? If you start to look at building names at the university, or people who were at the university between 1865 and, roughly 1960 or so, it would be hard to find any name that was on any building that might not be seen as problematic. So, for us, it was a matter of really wanting to have some hard and thoughtful conversations about reconciling memorialization and mission. What is the mission of the university? What is the mission of the university today? And, how do we reconcile the goal of memorializing certain individuals, some of whom were eugenicists, clearly white supremacists, clearly believed in the inferiority of African Americans. How do we reconcile the memorialization that exists on the name of the buildings with the current mission of the university? So I think that was really the impetus. And then as an outcome of the commission's work, what recommendations would we make about the renaming of building and spaces so as to better align the university with its own sense of mission?
Here we go. In Charlottesville in, I think maybe 2012, Kristen Sakos, who had just started on council, said, well, shouldn't we be rethinking the monuments that we have that represent our city, that represent an era that, and practices that we no longer want to represent our city. And then a few years after that, a high school student at the time, Zion Bryant, organized a petition, got hundreds of signatures from people, brought it to the attention of city council. Council did not have any consensus about what to do. I will say that there were a number of elements that were part of the task that council gave, you know, what to do with Court Square, Tonsler Park. You know, there were many, but most of the attention was on the Jackson and Lee statues that were up at the time. And so they tasked a group and they asked us to investigate what are the sources of these, when were they put up, why were they put up, you know, what's the history of them, and then also to engage the community into conversations about it. So that was our task, and that's what we did.
What was the makeup of the groups that you all served with, and how were members chosen for those groups? Yes, Karen, we'll give you the opportunity.
So our policy, it prescribes what the committee should look like. And with respect to reviewing or renaming schools, we open up a request. We send out a press release and ask folks to volunteer. And what we look for in terms of committee members is it's got to include at the minimum a committee leader who's designated, and the school principal, then 3 parents who currently have students in attendance at the school. And if we're talking about a middle or a high school, we also want to have 1 parent from each feeder school, each middle school that's feeding into that school. We want a minimum of 3 teachers or staff that are currently working in the school. And this includes, we've had people, everyone from vice principals to custodians to office assistants. We really cast that net very, very broadly. We want to have at least 2 student representatives if it's a high school, and then 2 community members who do not currently have children attending the school, but who live in the catchment area. And then we look for 1 central staff member who serves as the committee organizer, and that would be me. I'm the project manager. And then if we can, we want to make sure that we have some alumni present. And we've actually had alumni even from elementary schools, and that's a minimum. And so folks send in an email and they volunteer. We've got an email box set up for that school naming review. And then when we look at all the volunteers, and we try to make sure that we have a good balance in terms of diversity of thought, diversity of all aspects. And then hopefully we get a manageable number of folks who are willing and able to make the time commitment. And that's what we go with.
And so just a quick clarifying question there, Karen. That's for each school, there's a separate committee, and the only common thread there is probably your position there, or maybe some central office?
No, just me. I'm the representative for central office. And my role is to sort of facilitate the public meetings, as well as to provide technical assistance to the chair of the committee and to help walk them through. We have a prescribed process that was developed by the previous project manager, Jasmine Fernandez, and she did a terrific job of creating a process that allows the participants to sort of work through a series of offering surveys to the community. At the same time, they do research, and then what happens after they at least do 2 surveys during which community members have the opportunity to suggest names that can include the current name of the school. And after they've gone through the first survey, they come up with another round of the top names that they want to recommend. We also engage the students of the school. In the case of, for example, Journey Middle School, which was previously Jack Jewett Middle School, that name absolutely came from the students. But after the second round, they then deliberate and decide which name they want to elevate and send forward. And then they make a recommendation to the superintendent. And then the superintendent can accept that recommendation or come up with one of his own, and he then makes a recommendation to the school board, and then they choose what the name is going to be. And I think Journey was unique in that this was a case where that name was not necessarily, the survey is a opportunity for the committee to hear from a broad section of the community, but the committee is not constrained to those names. It's not a vote. They are suggestions, and the committee deliberates over those suggestions. They come to a consensus, and in that instance, they witnessed many projects that the students had done and saw that students were sort of coalescing around that name, and they decided to go with the kids. And so they make that decision. It's very much like jury duty, in my opinion. That's what it felt like when I was on the Broadestwood committee. And it's interesting because it brings together an interesting cross-section of folks, and they sort of, you know, build community around working through this process.
I don't want to interrupt the flow too much, but if I can ask a quick detail question, what was the scope of each of the 2 surveys? How were they different? It's 2 surveys in one consideration round, is it, for one school?
Yes. How are the surveys different?
Yeah. What's
the difference is the first survey just asked people to suggest names. And by the second survey, they're choosing between the names that came forward.
Okay, kind of a runoff in some sense.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
To how the members were chosen for the committee that you were on, if you are aware.
So I don't have a lot to say on that. I think if you'd like me to, Karen sort of also talked about the process at the same time. I could do those separately or just blend them together, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, we're going to want to hear both things, so go ahead.
All right, so the first thing I can say is I don't know how the members were chosen on this committee. You know, there's some things are kind of enigmatic as to why they happen the way they do. But I do know, what I do know is, in my own case, I had spent decades teaching a course on the history of the University of Virginia in the 20th century, as well as this class that Frank and Karen and I taught on multiple occasions called UVA History, Race, and Repair. So I think it was known that I knew something about this larger history of the university. I think that's probably why I ended up on the committee. The committee was made up of faculty, who mostly historians, librarians, people in facilities management who kind of knew where specific landscape places were, or places of memorialization existed. So I'd say a cross section, and very much an interracial group. And that's, I'm afraid, all I can say about how people were chosen. I do have more to say about the process, though, because, on one level I could say, well, what process did we use? Well, we did a lot of talking, to sort of come up with what we would want to say about the renaming. But here is where I think I can really be a little bit more specific. And I can, as I've already said, we recognize that our goal was to align a memorialization process with the mission of the university. And so we came up with certain principles in that regard. And I'll take a minute or two just to say what those principles were, because I think this might be helpful to your group. The first was, we said a university must pursue its mission as its principal responsibility and must consider a response when traditions, practices, or symbols undermine that mission. So that was principle number one. Principle number two was that all conversations around changes to monuments, memorials, or recontextualizations must be transparent and in alignment with the mission, should be seen as an opportunity for teaching and learning. And that becomes important in another way later on. The third principle was all conversations around potential name changes, monument removal, or recontextualization should include intentional engagement with all possible stakeholders. So not to be just the decision of a small group. 4, the decision to rename a building, remove a monument, or recontextualize either should depend on a scholarly consensus of that namesake's principal legacy. Now, you can imagine trying to figure out what someone's principal legacy is the real challenge here. And then, upon the decision to change a tradition or monument, the university has the responsibility to document the process and preserve as historical knowledge the assessment of the scholarly consensus, and preserve the reason for the change in a durable, long-standing venue to ensure that it is clearly change and not erasure. In other words, one of the principles was, we're not about erasing the past. So whatever change you make, you have to have some way both of documenting the process, but also after the naming, or as part of it, explaining for the public to see why that name changed. Okay. And then, if you can bear with me for just a few more minutes, we came up with 4 specific tests. Now, this might be a little bit different because this was the university with multiple different buildings that we were talking about. First test for the university and renaming was, is the person closely associated with the University of Virginia? I mean, if the person didn't have any association with the University of Virginia and the name's just on a building, and that person, in terms of their activities, that name doesn't align with our current mission, then it was potentially a no-brainer. But 1, is the person closely associated with the University of Virginia? 2, was the person's principal legacy contested in the moment of their lifetime? So, was that person's work, activity, life challenged at the time of their lifetime? 3, was the university's intent at the moment of naming at odds with the mission of the university? And then 4, is the person's principal legacy currently at odds with the mission of the university? And we believe that for the renaming process, you had to meet at least one of those tests for us to really consider it further. So I just decided to be a little bit more specific, because I think the process we went through led to these principles and tests, and I just thought it was sort of potentially interesting criteria for you to think about.
Anything that you would know about how
Sure.
members were chosen for your group, and then what the process?
Okay, sure. So this council decided they were going to hold this process, and they had a charge. I think it was quite a good charge. And they put out a call for people who were interested in being appointed, and some 80-some people, I think, were nominated themselves. And there were actually only 6 slots that were available generally, because there was a slot for the city's Places Committee, Historic Resources Committee, and Human Rights Committee. And I think I was chosen. Well, we don't know. I don't know who, what the vote was or anything like that, but it was council that decided who was going to be appointed to that. And then the process was left up. The charge was pretty, I think it's a really good charge to take a look at. It talked about engaging the community, talked about looking at a variety, like there were 12 different sites that we were, looking at, and getting a history and so forth. And then the process was somewhat left to us. So we nominated our own chair, which was Don Gathers, who I think he chaired that group very fairly. I think Don had come in, one of the people saying he thinks these statues should be removed, among other things. But he also wanted to make sure that everybody got a chance to speak. So we held every meeting that we had was public meeting. We moved them around to different places in the city so that different communities would have easier access to them. Every meeting started with 10 minutes of opportunity for the public to speak, and closed with an opportunity for the public to speak also. And then we had, I'm trying to remember now, I think it was three public forums. They were all public meetings, but these were actually meetings that were designed to get people, to offer people more of an opportunity to speak their mind and to speak to each other. And I think, others on the group may have had different views, but for me, it was less important what our group came up with, and more important that we were helping the community as a whole grapple with this question of what is our community going to be, and who do we want, what do we want to be showing and demonstrating as representing our community. And so the whole community needed to be engaged in that. And I think it certainly was engaged in that. And then ultimately we created a report, and we had a couple of historians on the committee who, the appendix is a couple hundred pages long. It's actually really, really well done, I think. And I can say that because I only contributed a tiny bit to it. And the history, much of which I had no idea also, is fascinating. I think a big part of it was hearing what some people would say was history, and then doing some research. And oftentimes we would find that actually, as you might imagine, a lot of what people hold to believe to be true about history is in fact not true. And sometimes it's exactly the opposite, if you can imagine something of that sort, of what people have been taught. So, and I think as the meetings continued over time, we started in June, ended in December, more and more people started getting engaged in the process. Everybody had a chance to speak. And if there were, if there was any raucous outcry, which there wasn't really any, the chair would make sure that they had an opportunity to speak. And so there really wasn't any problem with that at all. There was more to it. There were some working groups that, helped create the report, the working group on engagement, which was my interest. And we actually recruited some outside facilitators to come help with the conversations that we had. So that was essentially the process over 6 months, and then made a report. The report was unanimous about almost everything except the disposition of the statues, and there were a couple of different recommendations that were made about the statues, a couple of options presented to council. Council asked for options. They didn't say, what do you want? What is Charlottesville going to do? They wanted to be presented the options and what were the pros and cons of those options. And I think the committee did that.
Group had, which was, did you solicit community feedback? So clearly we've just heard from Frank that the Blue Ribbon Commission did, and Karen, you also mentioned quite a bit of community feedback. And if so, how did you ensure that all community voices were given the opportunity to be heard? So we've talked about, each of you's touched on that a little bit, but I think this working group is very interested in making sure that, because the library serves a very wide geographic area. It's the size of the state of Delaware, basically. So it's a tall order, and we're interested in how other organizations have made sure that they have engaged widely.
Our intentions in the school name review are to be reflective, accessible, and inclusion of all voices. And so we have we generally have an online survey, but we also generate paper copies. We work with the school community to get it out as broadly as we can. We have our Office of Communications do a press release on it, and so a story will go out. We've just opened up the Meriwether-Lewis survey. I put a link in the chat for all of you. So I invite you to please respond to it. We translate them, we put them on paper, we put QR codes all over the place, we put signs up that, around the school, so that as people are driving their kids to school or in the pickup line, or they go to the after school program, there are drop boxes, and we really try to amplify it as much as we can. We also put it on our social media and try to get as many voices as we can. I did want to say a quick word about the charge, because I didn't mention that typically our superintendent comes to our first meeting of the committee. Our committee does have closed organizational meetings, and then they also have open meetings, community forums, where anyone who wants to come or appear, and they've been Zoom, in person, they can just come and make their comments, and the committee hears them. We also keep a running tally of every email that comes in, and that's presented to the committee as well. But the charge that the superintendent generally gives is for the committee to imagine this is a brand new school. And what would you want it to be named? And keeping in mind our goals, our vision, and our mission, and our, we want to make sure that it is keeping with our values of wellness, excellence, equity, and there's one more, and it's just not coming to mind, but hold on, I can tell you what it is. And let's see, we want, oh gosh, excellence, wellness, community. Where are my values? This should be on the tip of my tongue. I am so sorry. I cannot remember them. There's so much on my mind.
Those are pretty good, the ones you named, Karen.
I'll tell you the rest of them in a little bit, but we try to amplify it as broadly as we can. And, I do think that it does go very, very far and wide. When we were doing Mary Carr Greer, we were contacted by members of her family, and that has happened on more than one occasion. So it's lovely.
So are you done, Karen? Okay. So in my case, I was part really of a small internal working group. So the question about soliciting community feedback and hearing all voices was not really relevant to the work that small committee did. But I would reiterate that in the recommendations that we made about a process, we said, I have it right here, that we basically agreed with all of the initial recommendations of that small Dean's working group that started in 2017. And we said we agreed especially for the call for reconsideration to be based on deep historical research and the need to engage open, public, and transparent discussions and processes. And I know in our work, we actually thought that to do that, you would really need to create quite a long window of time. And you'd have to, you'd have to put that research out there in lots of different public spaces for people to sort of think about it and consider it. Wasn't going to be open to a vote at the end, but again, we took our mission to educate very, very seriously. On to you, Frank.
Yeah, and I might be trespassing a little on the follow-up question too about challenge, but as I mentioned, all our meetings had public comment opportunity at the beginning and the end of the meeting. The meetings were recorded, so people could listen to them afterwards if they weren't there. We did have 3 meetings that were devoted specifically to this is your opportunity to talk at greater length and to talk with other people, to learn from other people as well. And then the email, so there was an email, but I would just say one of the challenges was there was no meeting summary done of each meeting. And so you either had to attend or listen to or hear rumors about, which is not a good practice. So I think that's a challenge. And then also the email, there was no staff person that responded to the email at all. So it was up to the individuals, and we were not responding on behalf of the committee, right? We were just responding on behalf of ourselves. So I think those, engagement is a two-way street. So you're giving people an opportunity to have their voices heard, but there should be an opportunity then to acknowledge those as well, which I did, and I'm sure other people did too, but I couldn't speak for the whole committee. So I think those were some of the challenges with engagement that could have been done better.
For each of you, if you could speak to what part of the process was the most valuable, either for yourself individually or what you thought was the most valuable for the group, and then on the flip side, what was the most challenging? Karen, you want to start us off?
Yes, I would say the most valuable is the time the committee members spend really sort of processing what they hear from the community. And then also the research that they do on the individuals. And by the way, let me just tell you guys the values: equity, family and community, excellence, and wellness. Sorry about that. But I think that's the most valuable part. As I said, when I served as a member of the committee, I was really deeply impressed by how such a diverse group, and we were very diverse, age-wise, racially, you name it, some people with little children, that we were able to come to consensus and to really have some deep conversations about and to learn. We reached out to the University of Virginia's experts on genealogy. We had Shelley Murphy and we had Jordy Yeager present some information to us about Mr. Wood. We also took a look at old school board records, And it was really interesting to hear it go from, some folks thought Broadus Wood was a place. Didn't realize he was a person. And to, sort of tease out, where we were on things. And so I think that was the most valuable, because oftentimes buildings are named for the person, for someone, and who they are is largely forgotten. It was the same with Mary Carr Greer. The community really got to understand who she was as an individual. We reached out to the Ivy Creek Foundation and got some wonderful information about her, and family members provided photos and things of that nature. So I think that was very valuable. The most challenging part is, David, I think, making sure that we hear all voices, making sure that we reach out to people in the community who are not just going to respond to something online, and to hear voices other than the really loud, it may even be a very vocal minority of people who are saying, one thing, and having an open mind and trying to really address the charge that's given. Our process, though, is so refined. I think the moving through the steps seems to be about the easiest. And then, sort of turning a deaf ear to folks that are, just maligning the whole process without really thinking through, what is the purpose, and the why, and the idea of having consistency across a system, that if you're going to be about equity and inclusion, you have to walk the talk.
Valuable and the most challenging parts of the process?
So I can just speak from my own perspective about that. I think one of the most valuable parts about the process for me was just working with colleagues from a diversity of backgrounds, and just the hard listening that was done, and trying to deal with what I think are very, very difficult questions. Of course, we didn't have the really difficult ones of having to recommend what should be done with specific places, just to come up with the processes. But even to come up with the processes, there were many differences of opinion, and I think maybe we didn't resolve all those differences, even though we sort of agreed to disagree on some things. But having, being able to hear from a diverse group of people what was motivating them and what they thought was most critical for the good of the university, that was really valuable for me personally. And then but at the same time, valuable but challenging, because we were really asking ourselves around a table to really reflect on how you deal with systemic racism in the university. What recommendations can you make as they relate to spaces that will really begin to address systemic racism? And then how do you weigh the good things that individuals who have been memorialized on some of these buildings did? How do you weigh the good things that they did with some of the, with some of the ideas that they held? And how do you how do you reconcile all that? So that was challenging. Another challenging thing for me, I mean, just within sort of is that we did this work. We met very regularly over a long period of time. We put together a very lengthy report. We recommended that we be voted out of existence and a new committee be created to then do that work on naming. And now my feeling is that's fallen into some sort of a void. And I have no idea what's really happened as a result of that. I think that happens often at large institutions. You know, you do your work, and so where is it? What's happened with it? And also my feeling that at the university there has been some renaming going on, but it's a very quiet process, at least in some cases. I mean, what we recommended, which was that it be open to a large period of public discussion and that there be some signage about the recontextualization and all of that. I don't see that's happening. And so that's a little, that's a little frustrating and challenging. But I guess when when you're no longer the cook in the kitchen, you don't have you don't have much ground to stand on. So I realize it's moved on to another part of the institution, and all I can say is I just hope that work was of some value.
Everybody's been so thoughtful. Karen, I love the process the county has gone through. It just has been so careful. And I love the inclusion, that you had, that the way that you're like student engagement, coming up with the idea journey, very clever, because it still acknowledges Jewett's journey, right? But it also is the journey that we're coming from, from children in elementary school to high school youth, So I love that. The Blue Ribbon Commission was certainly a challenging process at a lot of levels. From some people who said, why are you bothering doing this? Just take them down, to other people saying, why are you doing this? How dare you consider doing anything, touching, them? I'm going to be real candid. I think that we've been so deeply embedded in Virginia, but also our country, in white supremacy culture, in the racism that allowed for centuries of slavery and the diminishment of the indigenous peoples and African Americans and then other people of color. And I'm going to make a distinction between overt white supremacists, who actually still, we have plenty of those, who still will make very bold claims to the supremacy of whites. I'm putting that in parentheses. And then people like me, who've been influenced, like everybody who's been influenced by white supremacy culture. And that was really hard because there were so many stories that were told about Lee and Jackson that were simply false. And it's not really the fault of the people who brought these stories there. They were taught that. We saw examples of a textbook, a Virginia textbook, showing a ship, and there's a very well-dressed white man, in suit and, very well-dressed, and then an equally well-dressed African-American and his equally well-dressed family. And the white is shaking the hands of the African-American. And this is the welcome to slavery, that was the idea that and that was a textbook in Virginia. And, I went to high school in Virginia. I know some of what, was taught me, and shared those beliefs. So I think when you have something that is so deeply rooted in communities and memories and the way people are taught and the identity that people have, then when that's challenged, it's hard for people to come to understand that. And that's one reason why it needs to be an educational process. And we did actually, I haven't mentioned this, but we had a number of invited speakers, people with different sorts of expertise to come in and speak to the committee about history and memorialization and options. What has been done. Like, it's not so radical, actually taking down statues. It happens all the time, for instance. So I think getting out of that, but also doing it in a way, and there's a former student of mine who wrote something. It's difficult to have someone change their mind when they've been made to believe that they don't matter. So having to make everybody believe that you do matter, right? You might be wrong and you might have your facts wrong, but you do matter, and we want, we want you to be part of this community, and we have to come up with this decision together, and we have to confront it. We have to, it's not something we can keep pushing aside. So I'm very proud of the work that we did. The report, I think, is fantastic. I think in retrospect, we had no idea. We gave counsel, if you are going to keep the statues, which they might vote to do, and they voted to remove Lee and to keep Jackson, then you have to do so in a way that makes sure that people understand that these are not the values that we want to have represented in our community, and you have to tell the full story of this history. If you're going to remove them, you can't just whitewash that history. You can't just remove them and then say we're done. You really need to be telling the story of why they were put up there. So lots of challenges, and that work is still ongoing. So, but I'm proud of the work. I think for the most part, we did as good a job as we could have done, given what we knew, given who we had, given the time that we were in. So.
Ask the working group if there are any follow-up questions or any details that you want to get while we've got Karen and Frank and Phyllis here for a few more minutes. Hopefully they won't mind if we follow up with some process questions over time as the library looks at this. But anything anybody wants to ask about now?
I think one of the questions I had, and I'm not sure how to best address this, but one of the things I noticed that connected all three of your projects, even though they are very different one from the other, is that they seem to be united around the question of values. That it seemed as though you were concerned about how do we make sure that the decisions that we make reflect the values we hold as an organization. I understand that. And I also understand the need to make all voices in the community be heard. And especially those voices who might not be on the email list for, are already included. How do you balance maintaining or aligning yourself with your values with hearing from all parties, some of whom hold values that are in opposition? Like, how do you listen to everybody, hear from everybody, but then make a decision that is in line with your values that won't please everybody?
Well, in our case, we have made a very bold commitment in the Albemarle County Public Schools to be an anti-racist system. And we are working throughout our system to make that a reality, looking at everything from curricula to hiring to discipline. And so I believe our school board found it very difficult to cast ourselves as anti-racist if we are not going to have that value reflected throughout our system. And I want to be clear that that's not the only litmus test, whether someone's a white supremacist or racist, do they have any other nefarious activities, and it's I think where the real difficulty lies is when we have some of our more contemporary people like, Sutherland, Kale, they had, published materials that were clearly not aligned to the values that we have today in terms of excluding whole populations of students from things. Squaring that with, as Frank was saying, with these revered historical heroes and the sort of folklore that goes along with these individuals, that's where it becomes really difficult because people have such varied understanding of who those folks are. But when they are confronted with actual primary source materials and data that doesn't allow them to make any other choices, it's interesting. People sort of come to understand, yeah, that's not quite what we want our children to understand. And I think there's an understanding that what our generation understands is that what we want for our children. And when we look at it through a futuristic lens, it sort of changes things a bit, I believe.
Well, I really value the question, Lisa. I think you've gotten to the heart of what's so difficult about this whole process. For the work that we were doing at the university and the principles that we came up with, when you put down as a principle that you need to consider what an individual's principal legacy is, well, people have multiple legacies, so I mean, and after all, the University of Virginia venerates, the man in the room tonight, right? Thomas Jefferson, and he wanted to be remembered. His principal legacies, he said what they were, and they had nothing to do with slavery. But those principal legacies are also pretty important for the furtherance of of our democracy. So what is the principal legacy? How do you make that decision? And different people will have come down in very different places about that. So, and then if you say, okay, what is their principal legacy? Does it align with our mission and values? I don't know if it helps you. I don't know if then that helps you when you see, that Jefferson believed in education. He believed in religious tolerance. He founded the university, all these things. And he was a slaveholder. So which one of those trumps the others, And certainly in our committee, there were pretty different views about that. So it's a very big challenge, I think.
Great question. Yeah, I think, Lisa, if we could answer that one quickly, we could solve a lot of the world's problems, right? So I think kind of three dimensions. One is the idea that, and I said this at our last meeting, I don't believe I'm not any better person than anybody else in the room. We value everybody equally. And that also that the process has to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate. But part of the process is also uncovering truths. And sometimes there are multiple truths, people experience things different ways, but sometimes there are some things that are not true. And part of that process is uncovering some of the untruths that were so rampant in our history, and that allowed for us and do allow for us really, to treat people ways that are harmful. And so, somebody said, well, everyone's entitled to their opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. But I think it's even more than that. They're entitled to their opinion. They're entitled to respecting their dignity. They're entitled to participate, but they're not entitled to make claims that are not true without challenging them. And that's part of the deliberation process, is being able to get more complete understanding. Yeah, and as Phyllis is, you talked about Jefferson and the founder and so forth, and he was also one of the people most responsible for continuing slavery, for providing the intellectual justification of slavery with notes on the state of Virginia. That's not an argument for changing the name or keeping the name. That's just another dimension to understand, about him. And I'm just saying, that, I know, everybody here knows that, but I think the idea is that we get a process that that provides at least that you're making a decision based on the best understanding of not just history, but also the impact of that history and the meaning of that history and the impact of these people and what does that mean. So the rambling answer, but that's, we do the best that we can.
And can I add one more thing too? It's not necessarily about getting rid of the old name. It's important that your policy, that your process allows room for creativity, for creating something new. The old one may very well be okay, but because we asked the question, we may have a eureka moment and discover something entirely new and different that everyone can coalesce around. And I know you're a creative person. I've seen some of your work, Ms. Woolfolk, and it's about allowing a space for new things to be created, and then to just weigh that against the old one. Do we like that better? It may not just necessarily be about throwing the bum out.
Any other thoughts or questions that anybody has? This is invaluable for this working group to hear about what some of our peer organizations have done as they consider their organizations and their place in the community. So I really appreciate you all volunteering your time tonight to speak with us.
It's good to see everybody.
Thank you all.
Indeed, it's
Thank
good
you
to
all
be
very
here.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Best
so
of
much.
luck going forward.
Yeah, good luck
Yeah.
with your work.
Thank you very much.
Thank
We're
you so
grateful
much.
for your time.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
Glad to
Bye-bye.
help.
Bye.
Good night now.